the psychedelics program, what it's been is it's a student talk competition, and it's been a 7-week long process involving a lot of peer mentorship and collaboration where people put together talks expressing novel ideas in psychedelic science and humanities. So that's what this is about, empowering the future generation of leaders in psychedelic science and other aspects of the psychedelic ecosystem. So yeah, that's what this is. And we have a career panel for multiple career paths within the psychedelic field. So yeah, welcome to the academic panel. If everybody could just go around and give a brief 1 to 2 minute introduction about themselves, that would be fantastic.
Alphabetical.
Go for it, Peter.
I thought we could start with you, Robin, since we're going alphabetically by last name.
Okay, all right. So I'm Robin Carhart Harris. I have been researching for psychedelics for maybe 15 years if we count my PhD. These days I head up the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London. And the background of my research has been human brain imaging, and more recently, clinical trials in depression, looking at psilocybin therapy for depression, and some theoretical work on the action of psychedelics. Pleased to be with you all.
I guess I'll go next because it's alphabetical order. Yeah, I'm Manoj Das. I'm a postdoc at the Center for Psychedelic and Conscious Research at Johns Hopkins. So my background has been a bit of psychopharmacology, but initially I was more of a cognitive psychologist, cognitive neuroscientist studying episodic memory. And then I started studying kind of drugs broadly in order to kind of give some of my research more relevance. And then I've now sort of found myself especially studying psychedelics, but still in the context of other drugs to try to see what makes psychedelics special, if anything at all.
And hi, I'm Peter Hendricks. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, not in Tuscaloosa. Always have to say that. My own path to psychedelics was serendipitous. They were not on my radar until well into my postdoc. My background's in studying addiction with a focus on smoking cessation. And my interest in psychedelics really stems from a thought or hope that we could have a game changer on our hands in terms of therapeutic efficacy.
All right, thank you for introducing yourselves, everyone. We now have a bunch of questions that might potentially be interesting, but we intend to keep the conversation fairly free-flowing. So if something else comes up, we can just go down that tangent. So we'll start out with what is the best advice you ever got about being in psychedelic research or academia in general?
And should we start in order again, Haley, or it'd be nice to shuffle it as well. I'll go with my good old mum, who way back in the day, I had this opportunity to go and meet David Nutt. David Nutt was the former drug czar, as we call it, the chief advisor to the UK government on drugs, drug policy, drug science. Famously, sacked for telling the truth is the way it's said, which is true. And anyway, so this was my golden opportunity to get into psychedelic science, and I took it very seriously. And I went and stayed in a hotel in Bristol ahead of meeting this big important guy. And I had an idea, and it was to do LSD fMRI, and I thought I was gonna, solve the neurobiological basis of the unconscious mind, and this was my big idea. And so I was all, kind of excited and nervous about that, and I delivered the idea to him, and it felt like it fell on deaf ears. I had my interview, And then he, you know, linked me up with his colleague, who actually, the short story here, the spoiler is, became my PhD supervisor. And she didn't seem to like the idea either. So I left disappointed. But what had actually happened is they'd said, oh, you could do a PhD on something else. And I hadn't heard that. And I left thinking, you know, it had been disappointing and I wasn't going to be able to get to pursue my dream. So I called my mother, all kind of, you know, disappointed. And she said, Robin, it sounds like an opening, you know, take the opportunity, get your foot in the door. And she was right. And so, you know, long story short, I did my PhD in basic psychopharmacology. It actually transpired that I was looking at MDMA users and their sleep and doing some interesting things with dietary manipulations of serotonin levels. So anyway, the good advice was take your opportunities. You know.
I guess if we keep the alphabetical thing, I'll go next. So it's funny when you said like, what was the best advice? Initially, I was like, you hear a lot of bad things about academia, but you know, Robin has now reminded me that there are good things. And I, by the way, do like what I do, but you do hear about all these negative things, like how you shouldn't actually go into this. But what I think, as Robin said, yeah, taking those opportunities, I think, is good, and finding interest in things, for example, outside of psychedelic science, is I highly recommend. And I honestly think that just finding yourself immediately in a PhD, especially if you're looking into, you know, doing, for example, like brain imaging or more basic science questions, rather than, you know, Peter can probably speak to the clinical stuff here. He's, I think, the only clinician amongst us. And so, yeah, but as far as if you're interested in kind of like more basic science questions, I actually wouldn't even recommend immediately going into psychedelic science. I sometimes think that like you might want to, you know, find yourself studying something interesting and then bring that to psychedelic science later. So, you know, especially for, you know, something like visual perception, there's not really currently is there, I don't know, maybe I'm going to eat my words in a second, but there's not really a visual perception person currently who's like a really good perception, like neuroscientist who's currently studying psychedelics. And that seems like a very obvious sort of area of the field that it's like, that's one of the most obvious effects that are there. So yeah, highly recommend studying, yeah, just taking what you can get in some ways. And if anything, try to get something else. And then if you happen to get the opportunity, let's say in your PhD, to be able to study something like psychedelics, wonderful. But don't limit yourself to just, yeah, that.
Yeah, I think the three of us have some very similar feedback or advice that we've heard. Before I entered graduate school, I was working at a homeless shelter in San Francisco, and I saw addiction as a common thread among the people I was serving. And it was either you know, the primary factor that contributed to the homelessness, or at least one that was exacerbating their situation. So when I applied to graduate schools and interviewed with who would become my mentor, I found myself thinking about smoking cessation, and in fact, skeptical that that's really what I wanted to do. In part because people who smoke are fairly high functioning, their lives aren't rapidly spiraling out of control. So you really wonder the degree to which smoking is an addiction in the true sense, or maybe just a sort of a health behavior that needs to change at some point. But he sold me on the idea by saying, look, if you want to understand addiction, smoking is a great model. There are millions of smokers in the population. They're fairly easy to recruit and retain, at least relative to users of other substances. So if you actually want to finish graduate school, this is a great model to start with. Later, if you want to study other addictions, please do so. For now, you actually want to finish graduate school. And the objective here is to acquire the skill set that you need to apply to other topic areas. So I think, consistent with what's been said, if you're interested in psychedelics now, that's wonderful. The fact is, there just aren't many labs across the globe that are studying this topic. There are still very few, and I would probably guess that between Imperial and Johns Hopkins, that's the lion's share of the research that's been produced. So if you find yourself at a program that doesn't have an emphasis on psychedelics, that's perfectly fine. Hone your methodological skills, become, you know, very good at something, and apply that at a later point, because certainly the field will need people with diverse training and perspectives.
All right. So the next question is, what would you say is the number one skill that helped get you to your current position?
Let me see. I did jot down an answer. Oh gosh. I think, yeah, keeping on, and yeah, it's kind of, is it a skill? I don't know, or a pathology in a way, but a kind of like a monomania in a way. Yeah. You know, but in the section of biggest mistake, in a sense, like being too obsessed. Maybe yeah. Anyway, I think it's just a dedication. Yeah, fierce dedication, and keeping on.
So again, I'm going to echo Robin a little bit. So I had an advisor in at UC Davis, Charan Ranganath, and one of the smartest people I've like ever known as far as like every aspect of neuroscience and psychology. He's quite aware of, except psychopharmacology actually. But other than those things, he was like super smart guy. He can take information. He didn't even like learn to code, for example, like a lot of what we do, which is I was actually going to say is probably the skill that got me to where I'm at, is learning to code. But he can understand things very quickly. Despite that, he would say, it's like, I don't even know how to code, but he could very easily understand various analyses and whatever. And he was voted the smartest man in Davis at one point. He once said that he's like, I'm not smart, I just obsess about things. And I think that's a lot of us, that I don't actually always like. So I was going to say, learning to code is probably the best skill I got, especially from that lab, and that's continued me onwards to do things very efficiently. I'm not even a good coder, and it took me a while to, I think, even get to a point like the learning curve is steep for a lot of people. It was really steep for me, and but I was just you just keep persevering, and hopefully it gets you far.
Yeah, so again, we're all, I think, saying the same thing. I became very interested in some of the work on grit, which is a psychological construct. A researcher by the name of Duckworth has done some work in this area. And she had initially studied some young children who had been very successful with spelling bees. And she wanted to know how do you predict success at a spelling bee? Because these are all very bright children. And she found that they all enjoyed reading almost every waking hour of the day. They all read, and that wasn't a very good predictor of success because everyone was reading. But there was something that she called effortful work, as I remember. Work that's not especially fun. They all enjoyed reading, but they didn't enjoy, for instance, going through a thesaurus or a dictionary page by page and memorizing these words. That was work that felt like work. And she ultimately found that it was that sort of behavior that predicted success. And so, grit, as she defines it, is a combination of passion and persistence. So really, to echo what's been said here, when you do what we do, and I suspect when you do anything, you face a fair amount of rejection and failure, and you just have to refuse to give up. I mean, you really have to have almost, as Robin said, this pathological stubbornness and refusal to give up. And I would say, much like Manaj's colleague, I don't think of myself as especially bright, but I am very stubborn and will continue trying until I've exhausted all my options. And I think that's a good idea for anybody, is just to keep trying. And as a last note, if you've read some of Malcolm Gladwell, you'll find that the world is actually full of extremely bright and gifted, intelligent people who have in fact not done a great deal with their lives because they just haven't worked very hard, or they haven't quite had that grit that's needed to get by. And there are a lot of very, average people out there in terms of at least their, intelligence, whatever they've been given genetically, but who've worked so darn hard that they've accomplished a lot. So you really can't, I think, overstate the importance of working really hard and refusing to give up in the face of failure that could last in some cases for years. So don't give up. You're muted, Haley.
So another question is, it seems pretty much, at least to me, as soon as you get into this field, there's so many exciting possible projects to tackle and avenues to go down that haven't been explored. And I imagine other people in psychedelic research feel the same. How do you prioritize what projects to work on?
It's a good one because it is so important to, I mean, another question that we have in here, I think, is, what don't you like about your work? And emails popped up as the first thing. Like, there's just so much distraction, and there's so many opportunities and people, wanting a bit of your time. And I think you have to be quite ruthless. It gets to a point, I think, where you have to be quite strict and ruthless. And so prioritizing is very, very important, I think. And yeah, personally speaking, I guess I prioritize productivity. So I've started to be ruthless with emails. I know I'd love to be able to reply to everyone's email, but I don't. And that's just the way it has to be. And I do need to get on with my work. And so, is that selfish? I don't know. I don't think it is, because oftentimes it's like somebody's project that they want you to come in and do. And it's just about sort of stacking up it's an abstract one, how to prioritize. But, for me, I guess productivity is sort of how we're measured in some way as scientists, and you're getting stuff out for the public, especially now that papers should and can be open access. So I think it's justifiable, I hope, that I prioritize productivity and getting papers out.
So yeah, I prioritize, I guess, in terms of projects, wherever the money is at this point, because I am not my own independent researcher. I'm a postdoc, and so I have to go with what people want out of me, and this is where the money is, because I'm not exactly like I'm not happy with what I'm doing, but obviously if I had all the money, I would be doing different projects, than exactly what I would be doing. And so in that sense, yeah, I'm just prioritizing what my bosses tell me to do sometimes. But Robin's right though, that there's a lot of people that'll come after you and come after your time, I should say. And and sometimes being ruthless about it. Like I've recently there was I don't want to drop anybody's name here, but there was somebody that came after me that was asking about a venture capitalist and asking if, hey, do you want to hear this project out? And I actually had very little idea of who this person was or what the project was. And they gave me some documents, and I should have probably should have looked through them, but I didn't, because I don't have time and I needed to do my actual work. But I did decide to meet with them. And here's an example of being ruthless: is I basically just laughed at their idea and was just like, bye. Which is, I was having a bad day, I think, and I think that it was a particularly, I wouldn't have done that maybe otherwise, but that was it was an hour of me listening to this guy telling me about all the drugs he did. And so it was just like, this is, what am I doing here? So yeah, I should probably get better about not answering emails and these types of people. So I'm still learning how to prioritize my time, honestly. Yeah.
I almost started talking like you, Haley, muted. There's a meditation by Oscar Romero, who's was a noted sort of political activist of sorts in El Salvador, and he sort of mentions that for most of us, our work might be like contributing one brick to a large cathedral. And I think if we first have some perspective and realize there are an infinite number of questions that could be asked and projects that could be done, and there's just no way that we're going to be able to do everything. But if you get the sense that you're contributing something that's small but important, then that can provide that motivation to begin with. I think many of the projects I've seen recently, I probably thought, boy, I wish I had done that. That was great. But I could listen through Abbey Road and say, I wish I had written that album. There's only so much time we have. In addition to what's been said, I would just say, focus on what you really enjoy doing. It makes a big difference, I've found. And having done a lot of work in sort of basic behavioral interventions for smoking, which were important, but that just didn't really light my fire. Now doing this work and really, really enjoying it. I mean, just coming into work, excited to be here, even though I spent a lot of time, working on administrative things and looking over Excel spreadsheets and accounts. And, people often have this idea, and perhaps the other two here can comment on this, that I work in like a Zen spa, and that I'm administering psilocybin every day. And it's a very relaxing environment. But I mean, that represents maybe 1% of what I do. And the rest is, fairly stressful and or not that fun, effortful. But it really helps when you feel like you're doing something you really enjoy and you feel like could really make a difference in people's lives. So in addition to what's been said, yeah, I am assaulted by emails, and I assault people with emails daily, but really focus on what you love to do and it'll make a big difference.
Very much echo that while we wait. Yeah, helps.
So that kind of, I guess you partially answered the next question, but we'll open up the floor to others. So a lot of people are very enthusiastic about psychedelic research and just imagine it being like the funnest thing in the world or whatever. Talk more about the parts of your job that you don't like.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, well, I've got to be honest, I love the vast majority of it. I feel very lucky, and I try and, be conscious of my good fortune and where I found myself. And yeah, to slow down isn't an easy thing, but the value of slowing down to reflect on little successes and things, and because otherwise you're just carried along by this train that is looking for the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, and there's no satisfaction. And it's yeah, but so I that's not really answering your question, because it's more just saying I love what I do, but I don't really love the yeah, I don't really love the the how do I say it? I don't I don't really like the egoic side of it, and whether that's obviously there's something to watch in oneself in terms of ego drive pushing you along, but a lot of pitfalls there. But I really don't like the ego pumping that happens from others. I struggle with people saying nice things about me based on the work that I've done, and I don't think that they think they're doing something nice, and I don't think they are in a way. And I want to tell them to stop and say it's not healthy. No, please stop. So that's a difficult thing to say, because it sounds like I get a lot of it, but it's more just I don't like that. I don't think it's a healthy thing. I don't think any kind of bigging up, inflating does any good. Yeah.
So I think, yeah, what I just generally don't like is sometimes the academic structure. I mean, I love academia for many reasons. I love that, at least, when it wasn't the pandemic, I could, spend like a quarter of the year in out of state and still be doing work from everywhere and getting to work when I want. I don't have the best sleep schedule, and so it's great to be able to work at 4 a.m. but then also not start work the next day till like noon. There's obviously limits for example, when you're actually out there collecting data, but as Peter said, that's like 1% of what we do is actually giving people drugs and watching them. Yeah, but there can be just various things in academia, like for example, like as Robin said, productivity, pumping out things as quickly as possible without really thinking about them is something that it gets more rewards, especially from like really big institutions, like Hopkins, for example. I think, there's, I'm not the only person that said this, but yeah, there's definitely, because of their reputation, anything they put out, it doesn't even necessarily have to be great, but because it's Hopkins, it gets picked up by the media, whatever. And so in many ways, there's pressure to just publish, even if it's not always the best work. And so I hate that. And I've really tried to push back against that and try to, I instead of publishing like one paper, instead of publishing like one data set, I'd rather put many things together and try to get something big out. And so I think that's something, and it's not just a Hopkins, it's across the whole field. People will say publish or perish, your H index is all that matters. And so I think that's something I really dislike about my job. And yeah.
That's a good question. I don't want to be redundant with what's been said. I'll say I absolutely agree with what's been said so far. And then maybe to add to that, it's certainly interesting working in this line and being present to some of these transcendent, mystical type experiences, or whatever we want to call them, where often an insight might be that what ultimately mattered more than anything, or what matters more than anything, is the time you spend with the people you love. And that certainly raises questions for those of us who work in this area about work-life balance. And, as I said, there are so many things that we could do, so many studies we could run. And there's something, unique about working in a field that the media has unique interest in. Maybe it can be alluring. It can be, in some ways addictive. And I think it's been noted that in the past, Timothy Leary really seemed to enjoy the media attention, and that might have been, part of his downfall in part. So, I think it helps to keep perspective, and again, realize there's only so much you can do. That the media attention ultimately won't really lead to anything meaningful. There are people, I think, who are really struggling on this planet and can really benefit from this work. And I think they deserve our very best effort, and they deserve us really trying our best. But, ultimately we're people with families and children, and, we can only work but so much. So, I think it is true that our employers would probably have no problem if we were working 24 hours a day, every day. They won't tell us to find that balance. So it's something that you'll have to do yourself. I wouldn't say that I hate this about my job, but I would just say it's important to remember ultimately that you've got to keep things in balance. And I wouldn't devote all of your efforts to this line of work. I should also say, it's funny when you work in this area, sometimes people have this sense that you're some sort of guru or shaman, that you possess wisdom just because you're involved with these experiences that are often transcendent and about life's meaning. And I find that sometimes I have to go out of my way to say that at best I'm like Jerry Lewis from The Nutty Professor. Like I definitely don't have any answers to life's big questions. I'm just an average sort of scientist. So after I've said what I've just said, I should say, but what do I know?
I think you're doing a disservice to yourself, Peter. I think you're very wise. Sorry.
All right. What kind of person should seriously attempt to pursue an academic career? What is a sign that a person might be better off trying something else?
Yeah, this one got me thinking. I guess you essentially think of a few examples that you've come across, and I have had people I've worked with who are very high energy, very creative, a lot of ideas, some good ideas, but they struggle with focus, and maybe sometimes they struggle with deliverable as well. Getting things done and done, thoroughly and properly, with checking of things. And so, some people are just very creative, very smart, but I'm not sure they're for the discipline of science, the disciplined nature of science. And then there are others who are wonderful beings, naturally caring beings that are better in the caring service world than in the disciplined scientific world. So yeah, there's room for a lot of skill sets, but if it's research that we're talking about, it helps to be able to be thorough, I think. Yeah, and maybe that's a skill you learn as well, but it's an important one.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is I don't know if everybody would agree with this, but I definitely don't think most people or anybody should go into a PhD program immediately after undergrad. I think that it's worth doing a couple years working in a lab, like as a research assistant, and trying to figure out, and hopefully it's a good lab too, that like doesn't just treat you like a you know, another cog in the machine, but you actually get your own project. Of course, you'll have to also do things like you know, change the ink cartridges for the printer and whatnot as you know, one of those jobs. But you hopefully you're in a lab where they actually give you, you know, a research project to work on that you can take on and you can learn from, and can allow you to go to conferences and just see how like academia works. And then if you still like it after that, then I feel like, okay, go for a PhD program. But yeah, even in your PhD program, it's totally normal. Like most people who get a science, you know, PhD don't end up remaining in academia, or at least in like a research institute in any case. And so yeah, I don't know if that helps anybody figure out if they're meant for it. I think, you know, what Robin said is certainly right. Like having a bunch of ideas is one thing, but being able to execute them, being able to also be really critical of things, I think is important, and not getting so excited that, you know, this is the only way that it can work, but being able to criticize your own work, I think is actually really important, and being able to take that kind of criticism and not just get so excited and delusional about your own ideas that yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, yeah, important as well.
I would probably just again reiterate how important it is to be resilient and you know, gritty, just to keep at it, even when, you know, maybe a number of signs point to potentially giving up. You really have to keep at it, and you'll very likely experience, you know, failure, rejection, whatever it might be, you know, countless times, and you just have to just brush it off your shoulder and keep going. Can't take it personally. Even when you're, you know, very successful, I'm sure anyone could say that you still deal with a great deal of criticism and rejection, and you just got to shrug it off and keep going.
All right. One question somebody had is, how do you think psychedelic research would be different if academia was more collaborative and inviting of open science?
Well, I would say that it's moving in the right direction. I find academia very collaborative these days, rubbing shoulders a bit with the commercial world. It's different, you know. I like the sharing nature, you know, for the sake of sort of collective knowledge. That spirit that you get in academia is a very, you know, very high value, I think, you know, for the sake of all of our knowledge, you know, together, working together for its advancement. So there's a lot of that's good in academia around that spirit, and, you know, driving that openness. So I do, yeah, what could I say that's negative there? It's sort of going in the right direction. You know, there are obviously some exceptions to that rule, but I don't think it pays off. You know, when people are too competitive in sort of underhand ways, I don't think it will bring satisfaction. So yeah, I would speak more to the positive of the academic culture, which is generally around collaboration and sharing and being open.
So yeah, I mean, I think that it can be really collaborative, but I think something that I've actually noticed is sometimes in clinical environments, there's certainly a lot more territory that's going on, which is it's ironic because you'll have these papers of like, 20 people. It starts to look like, physics papers that have like 100 people. Whereas if you do just like basic cognitive neuroscience research, you can actually have an fMRI, a single fMRI study with like 2 people, or even 1 person I've seen. And so there is a lot of collaboration, but yet there is a lot of weird territory. And without saying any names, for example, like I've certainly heard of people keeping their IRB documents, or refusing to share their data, even if it's just like a survey, for example. Like it's one thing if you have a really expensive data set, and so for example, we have this data set with salvia. We want to get a couple analyses out of it. We probably won't get more than 2 or something papers out of it, but we do plan on putting those data up online. But there's going to be some kind of embargo period, like a couple years or something like that. But there's people I know who don't even want to do that. And I think that I think the question was the hypotheticals, if we were to have this, I think that it would certainly improve things. There's no reason ever at this point that anybody should do, keep analyzing a single resting state, let's say LSD data set, because I think there's 2 or 3 of those out there, in the world at this point. And I realize, I think the one in Switzerland, it involves one of them with Matthias Leichty's group. There's commercial interest in there, and so I don't know if they're allowed to share theirs at this moment, but at least in a couple years, hopefully they should. And we'll have 3 LSD data sets, including I think Catherine Preller's and then Robbins, which Robbins I think is online currently, right? And so never again will we ever need these 15 people data sets, and we can actually look at 45 people, which is better, maybe still not great for looking at individual difference, correlations, but we would certainly have a much better idea of what's going on. So I don't know, if there were more kind of open science, I think we'd have a lot better, we'd have a lot better data sets out there. And it would, fortunately, maybe I should say, but it would almost certainly put a hole in a lot of other people's research. Like with this 12-person sample salvia study we did, I guarantee you, once they run another study with 20 people, once somebody does that, a lot of our effects probably won't replicate, and I'm fine with that. And I hope that people are willing to admit when, oh, hey, well, that was, the first study, 15 people, whatever. Yeah.
And I'll just say that I think the field is very open. I've certainly heard stories of people refusing to share protocols or IRB documents. I've heard stories of people even feeling like their ideas had been stolen, but this has never happened to me at any point in my 22 years. And in the psychedelic field, I feel is about as collaborative and open as any. I've had nothing but very, very positive interactions with everybody. Everybody's very collaborative and open and sharing data. So I would say that you're sort of seeing what can happen when things are very open, because they are. I think that's not holding us back. I think maybe the limiting factor, at least in the US, is that we don't yet have public funding, or at least not much of it, from entities like the NIH. And many of us are dependent on donations from private angel donors. Of course, we're extremely grateful for that funding, but there's nothing quite like having the full power of the US government with untold potentially trillions that could be devoted to this line of work. So that's something that I'm hoping that will change soon, because right now it really is a small number of us doing what we can on relatively small budgets.
All right. I know you've already all given your general advice about doing well in research, but is there any very counterintuitive or unconventional advice you would offer to people?
Yeah, I mean, a couple have already been mentioned. One Manoj just mentioned, which I thought anyway, which is that it's good. It's good to be wrong. Being wrong is good. I remember early on in some of our imaging work, we found results that looked inconsistent with previous work, and then that developed into a narrative that later on, I'm not sure necessarily holds up. So the ability to adapt your models, which is what we're always doing, our hypotheses, our models, our priors, and update them is, I mean, that's more intuitively a good thing, but you don't realize it, you know, because you get precious about an idea and you want it to be right. But actually when you can find the flaws in it, you know, that should then become the quest. Where are the flaws in this? And that could be a personal quest because you want to improve your idea, or yeah, and somewhat related, maybe another one would be that there's no end zone, you know, there's no, oh, I've done it now. So you might, well, of course we set ourselves goals, but one thing I've realized is you achieve some goals, before you know it, there's another one, you know. And so yeah.
Yeah, I guess for unconventional, that, yeah, sometimes it's set yourself up to lose, and if you still win, then I don't know, maybe you're doing something right. I mean, but seriously though, so it's like with, you know, basic cognitive research with behavior, a lot of times you want to do use certain paradigms in which, hey, we think this process exists, and you really want to set yourself up to lose in that situation. And if it still works, like, and this is actually, you know what, there's a piece of advice Aidan Horner once I saw put out there on Twitter. He's a UK memory researcher, fMRI researcher, and he said something like, I like to, you know, when I have a new behavioral paradigm, he's like, I like to find an effect and then afterwards try to figure out how to break that effect. And I think like for example, changing your stimuli, you know, if it only worked with like animal objects or something, like the animals, and then you change it to like houses and it no longer works with houses, it's like, did you really have something that was interesting or significant in any ways, like meaningful? So yeah, sometimes figuring out how to make things break, and this can also be said with like different analyses. You know, if you look at, for example, there's many, you know, one thing big right now in psychedelic research is you know, thanks to Robin, is a lot of the complexity measures, all the information theory measures. If, for example, entropy works, but then, you know, something like the Lempel-Ziv compression doesn't, you know, there could be reasons for that, but usually those two things should probably scale together. And if both of them don't work, then you probably don't have a real thing. And so I think you can do that with all kinds of different analyses. For example, just, you know, looking at your data in different ways, and yeah, try to break what you think exists. And if it can still hold up, then I think you've got something good.
So unconventional advice, I mean, Haley, I should say Haley is my doctoral student and she's typically just outside the door here. I mean, have I given any unconventional advice that you can think of at the moment? Not embarrassing me, I guess.
I mean, one thing that you've always stressed to me is to focus on collecting data over creating conceptual frameworks. So
I don't think that's unconventional. Yeah, one thing I really emphasize is let's, you know, collect original data. But I think that's what most scientists would say. You know, we like data. Let's collect original data. I can't think of anything unconventional I've said at the moment. But you know, I would say this, that there are so many different paths that one could take to, you know, ending up in their career ultimately and finding themselves very happy with what they're doing. I think it's really hard to predict where you'll be in the future and how you'll feel about what you're doing. So, you know, it might help to be, despite a sense of sort of anxiety or eagerness, urgency, to be okay with the idea that, you know, your path will likely be winding and you'll find yourself in 5 or 10 years looking back and saying, I never would have thought I'd be here. I never would have thought I'd be working with psilocybin on a trial of cocaine dependence. I never thought I'd be here. There's no way I could have predicted that. And I think if you try your best to go with the flow and maybe consider what your like primary overarching values are, you'll likely end up in a place where you'll be happy. I don't know if that's unconventional though. I can't think of anything unconventional I've said. Maybe it's unconventional for me to say, don't work too hard. So I'd say that. Find balance in your life.
How does everybody recommend that people try to maintain a work-life balance? How can that be done?
Oh, it's hard. I mean, in my younger years, I didn't. And actually, I remember during my PhD, somebody I sat in the office with told me to get a life. Yeah, and I was like, you know, really hurt because I was a young man and vulnerable and sensitive, and that was, you know. But then I look back on those years of working, you know, into the night, cooking pasta in a kettle. I don't know why I'm admitting that, but ridiculous, isn't it? But just like everything had to be fast and just done, functional to get back to the computer and but it helped in a way. Like, did I lose out in those years? Yeah, probably, but not really. Still got up to, you know, mischief and fun. But these days, you know, I've got 2 young kids and priorities change. And of course, that's a much more, you know, relevant consideration because it's about others to give up my time. But it's also a, you know, personal thing as well. It gives me pleasure when I slow down and shift focus and realize what's most important. Yeah. Meditation helps, and reading, you know, wise words from wise people. That's helped me.
Yeah, so yeah, I definitely have gone through many phases of, including right now, of not having a life. And you know, again, I'm gonna say another reason to not go do a PhD program right away is, you know, to work regular 40-hour weeks as a lab manager somewhere, you know. I remember it was after I did a master's actually in London. That's when I met Robin actually. And after, you know, during the master's, yeah, especially, you know, when you're writing your thesis, you're going to be working several hour, like ridiculous hour weeks. And especially in the UK, this is a 1-year, you know, program. So you're like trying to run a whole experiment and then write about it all within a year. And it's a pretty crazy time. And then I started, after doing that, after getting into myself into a lot of debt by doing that, I then worked in a lab for 2 years. And you know, when I first started working there, I was like staying there till like 6, 7 o'clock. And one of the postdocs is just like, what are you doing? Like, you're not in a PhD program. You're not a postdoc. Like, go have fun. And you know, I really, in some ways, I almost regret that, because in that lab at UC Davis, it was probably the place where I could have like picked up the most skills really quickly. There were just so many resources and so many smart people, not even just in the lab, but in all the neighboring labs, and everybody was talking to each other. And I still picked up quite a few skills, but you know, I also, you know, went and what did Robin say? I got into some mischief. San Francisco was not very far away, and so yeah, I think that definitely doing all that beforehand can be really important. And then at least while you know, in my PhD and then now, one reason why I don't have much of a life now is traveling, I think really helped. So using there's a lot of resources to go to conferences, and you can find yourself, you know, going to like 5 conferences a year if you're really productive, you know, a particular year. And there's enough funding between your, you know, advisor and internal grants and you know, travel awards and whatnot. And when you go away for like, you get, and you're really broke as a grad student, usually, at least most people I knew were. And so I was definitely really broke. But when you're getting, for example, like $500 for a plane ticket, and you know, your stay, you can also then afterwards, if you have a buddy, for example, that lives in the area, you can then go hang out afterwards, and basically you get a free trip somewhere, and then you can spend a week, you know, hanging out with a friend afterwards. And so that's one way that I've really allowed myself to have some balance, is although there's still a lot of work going on, but I've spent a lot of time just away, and I think that's helped me, even though sometimes when I'm away I'm still working. Like, even if, like, you know, if I'm spending a week hanging out with a friend somewhere, usually they still have to go to work, and so I'll still work during the days as well. But it's nice to even just find yourself in a coffee shop in the middle of some city you've never been, and yeah, you know, working that way and getting to like observe the culture and whatever. So yeah, traveling, I recommend that.
And I'll, you know, I should comment that there are a number of people I know who really love working, like who really, really love working. And if they just love working 14, 15, 16 hours every day and on the weekends, if that's what brings them meaning, then, you know, wonderful. I don't I don't think most of us are like that, however. So, my training is mostly in behaviorism. So I would just try to be very objective. I'd say I won't work beyond this time today. I'll make sure I'm home with my kids by this time, and I won't work on the weekends. I will put my phone down and out of sight after a certain time on the weekdays and on the weekends. And I'll try not to work more than 50 hours this week. That's just one example. So if you want balance, I think you just have to have very clear rules around how long you'll work and when, and hold yourself to them, even though somebody's out there. Minaj is working harder than me right now and beating me to the punch, and he's going to publish something before I do. That's inevitable. So you just have to, take yourself home and be all right with the fact that there will be a number of songs out there that will be written that you wish you had written yourself.
All right. I feel like that's most of the questions that we at least had wrote down initially. So I'll look at the audience Q&A.
Well, I've been answering them.
Okay.
There's one that's pretty interesting. It says, can you comment on opposing views of your research? This is from Justin Andrew. Research findings and how you incorporate or not those views in your work moving forward. Opposing views of your findings, how do you incorporate them into your work? I'm curious as to how people feel about that.
You just cite the study and then you go on with it and just say, but see, blah, blah, blah.
That's it.
I mean, in some ways, I think I was actually being serious. I think that because sometimes you can't, you have word limits in a lot of your papers, right? And so, especially if it's a review, I think it's worth going into these things. But sometimes when you have a paper and, like for example, again, going back to the information theory, entropy and whatnot. Usually it's been shown that some of these drugs increase, measures of signal variability, but there's certainly cases in which they don't. And depending on your measure. And that's what I've done is I go, but see, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I don't have time to go into the full, how these things were measured and whatever. But I think it's important to put that information out there, and I'm putting it out there for other people to see and for them to be like, wait a minute. Oh, hey, there are contrasting views here. But I think if you're in a review, if you're writing a review, you should definitely get into that in way more detail.
Yeah, I guess it's a mark of a good review if you present the other side of it once you've provided evidence for another side, perhaps the main side that you're endorsing. It's kind of like a measure of whether the review, the perspective piece is a quality piece. But I guess it depends on the specifics. I could think of one particular pre-processing step, dreaded global signal regression, that bothers me because I so then it becomes, well, I want, because I have quite a strong view in that I want people to understand the brain action of a drug, and I really believe that global signal regression is problematic, for example. And so then there's some motivation to do a bit of work into that question to demonstrate why we should think very carefully about global signal regression in our fMRI analyses of drugs that have profound effects on global brain function. So it depends on the specifics. Like if it's an opposing hypothesis on a hypothesis, then that's okay. We'll run experiments and see which ones hold up. But when it's, I guess, it depends on the specifics. But anyway, I thought about global signal regression because that's something I was working on before jumping on this call. And it is something that bothers me, to be pulling out meaningful signal. But you'll find other views. And the problem I have with it is that results can come out that then, feed interpretations that may be wrong, in my view, misleading. And so then there's almost a responsibility, if you feel strongly that the step is wrong, to do something about it and say something about it.
So I think one way to address that, which I think Katrin has, which by the way, because I think this is where the contention is a little bit, right, between you and Katrin. I think though that the way she addresses it is that she does it both ways and then has in the supplement the other way. And I think that's, and by the way, I'm coming from somebody who's like you, like everybody that I'm with hates global signal regression. But I think the way she's doing it is right, that to do both ways. And if you look at her data, the other, when you don't do global signal regression, it really doesn't make sense. And maybe it's because, she does things in a slightly different way. She's doing a voxel wise, a global functional connectivity compared to y'all did it in node wise, right? I don't know if that actually should make a difference, honestly, but it really didn't make sense. Like we tried looking through it and seeing like, wait, there's no linear step effects here when you go from 20 minutes, 40 minutes, 60 minutes into the psilocybin effects. And maybe that's true. There's not a linear response function in the brain, but yeah, her data don't make sense the other way. They just don't. And so I think the way to address conflicting views is to just do it both ways and then let other people decide. And here I think that at least with her data, I think she did do it the right way. Maybe,
To her credit, she did do both. I guess one was the dominant narrative and one got relegated to supplementary. But I just think probably the healthiest thing is to say more work in that space, because it does affect interpretations. And the worst outcome of it was a certain, philosopher sort of jumped on that and said, "I don't believe brain effects of psychedelics. Psychedelics work beyond the brain. The results are inconsistent." And that really bothered me. It was sort of arguing for sort of idealism and beyond.
Yeah, but people can say that from anything in science, like literally because two people who do the exact same analyses with 15 subjects each and they find different effects. Oh yeah, this is beyond science. And it's like, no, that's like sampling problems. That 15 people isn't enough. But I mean, the fact is that y'all did, by the way, get some of the same effects, right? And it's also now been shown with the other Swiss group that you did get increased global functional connectivity of the thalamus, right? That was the most consistent effect. I think it might not even so much be a global signal problem as it is, which it could be related to that, but it also probably is just that we're running these studies with only 15 to 20 subjects, and that's just not enough, and you're going to get different results each time. But you know what? The results that you do get that are the same are probably, they're more likely to be the real ones, which the thalamus here seemed to be the important one out of all those findings.
We are going into the weeds here. Without global signal regression, we have results with
Haley wants us to stop talking.
Yeah, this is probably not general career advice for people. So
let me say this, just for someone who doesn't really understand the imaging very well. Let me just say this. I've thought a lot about what in the world is happening. What's the mechanism of action, and with psychedelics, and a number of very tantalizing hypotheses have been proposed. And I certainly think there's something to mystical type experiences. I certainly think there's something to normalization of the default mode network, maybe something also to chronic inflammation, maybe also something to downregulation of serotonin receptors, maybe also something to plasticity. But subjective effects can vary widely. And sometimes you do see someone who has that sort of classic mystical experience. Other times, someone might not have a great deal to say or spends a fair amount of time, terrified and anxious. And yet we still see, despite these sort of diverging experiences, outcomes that can be relatively similar. So it can be kind of perplexing when you ask yourself really what's happening here. And I think we have to be okay with then chaos, the idea that there could be any number of different factors that overlap and interact with each other. And it could be that the mechanisms might even differ on an individual basis. I don't know. There's a lot of complexity in the data, as these two have indicated. And I think to get at that question, ultimately, the answer is that there are probably any number of factors. Single factor or single variable explanations will never be sufficient. There's a lot going on, both neurobiologically and psychologically. And ultimately getting at that is going to require years of research well after we're all gone. And sort of disentangling all these interesting relationships will require some unique analyses and probably very large data sets, which speaks to open science also. But it's a complex sort of process, and if you're looking for a simple explanation, you're not going to get it. So you deal with these, I think, inconsistencies by just being sort of embracing the chaos in it all.
And the long view, that it's a process towards, reliable principles.
Well, thank you everybody so much for all of your time. I'm sure that you've provided students with a lot of helpful insights. I know I found this especially interesting. So thank you, everyone. And be sure to watch the student talks. They're on the PsychedelX YouTube channel. They're very well put together. I'm just blown away and in awe by the new ideas presented and the production value as well. So, all right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Haley.
Thanks, Haley, for doing this.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate it all.